there has always been this part, and I think that's something that a lot of employees and people in the workforce of my age also are experiencing. There's always been this little component that was missing, and it's this added component of knowing that you're doing something that contributes something meaningful to society and for the climate.
Hey, Future Juan here. Unfortunately, during this recording, my video has a couple of times not worked quite well, more than a couple of times probably, but the audio is okay. So don't worry if you're just listening to the podcast. Actually, the audio from David is working all the time. So I'm really sorry for these issues. I'll definitely try to sort them out for the next recording. Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of the podcast Startup Founders by Inside the Product. Today, I'm really happy to have here David Budde, who is the CEO and co-founder of Trawa. Trawa is a company that is building solutions to get renewable and affordable electricity for your company and help you optimize your company's electricity procurement. So welcome, David, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so maybe you can introduce yourself a little bit and let the audience know who are you and a little bit of your background and your experience.
Yeah, for sure. My name is David Budde, as you mentioned. I am born and raised in Berlin, and I'm actually now back here for a few years. I am a business graduate from my background, later moved into business analytics to learn a little bit more about technical data analysis. And then over the course of the last few years, I was a management consultant with Bain & Company, working for a lot of different industries, a lot of different strategic projects. And for roughly a year now, I've been very heavily involved and working with the B2B renewable electricity market. I founded Trawa last year together with two fantastic colleagues of mine who are also previous management consultants. And we just raised our first pre-seed round of financing at the beginning of this year. We have an office here in Berlin Mitte in the center of the city, and we're very excited about everything that's come.
That is really cool, and congratulations for your first fundraise. It's probably a very exciting time to go through.
Definitely, yeah. I also have to admit that I thought it was going to be easier, but we're really glad that it worked out, and we have some fantastic investors that put their trust into us. Speed Invest is one of our lead investors, along with a Berlin-based fund called Magnetic, and we have a few others. Absolutely fantastic team of investors that we were able to gather.
That's really nice. Let's come back later, maybe, to the topic a little bit on the investors and how to communicate with them, and what would you think are the best practices and recommendations for other people that might be listening. But maybe diving a little bit deeper in your background. You have been already working in other startups. How have that helped you build when you have been now building Trawa?
Yeah, definitely. To be honest, working for a startup, working closely with a startup founder was the first real professional experience I ever had back in 2012 when I graduated from high school. Before I was even sure that I was going to study business management, I started working for Anna Alex, who was then the founder of an e-commerce company called Outfittery, and later would proceed to also become a climate tech founding and then later selling Planetly, a carbon emissions tracking software. But, having very early experiences working with other founders, working in early stage teams was definitely something that primed me to build a company of my own later on, because you get to see, a lot of the tasks that I now have to work on. I have to work on hiring great people. I have to work on taking things from an idea to an early MVP to later like a V1 of the product, working with potential customers. But I think the most important thing that you learn, as opposed to the skills that I learned in management consulting later on in my later career, is this idea of, just trying to get it to work, and just not being afraid of, doing something not perfectly, which is very different to the way that management consultants work. And I think that's probably the single most important skill that I learned in the other startups that I worked for.
Yeah, that is so true. That especially in tech and startups, when building the first iterations of a product, it's like trying to get that first feedback of, are we going in the right direction, than necessarily getting it right, because most likely you're not going to get it right. So I think that's a very, really interesting approach. Can you tell us maybe a little bit of what Trava is? Who is it for? What is the value proposition? Just to understand a little bit better what you're trying to achieve now.
Yeah, definitely. So Trava is a solution. I'm just going to call it a solution because it consists of multiple components. One of the components is a software that has an AI-based algorithm and some machine learning components to it as well. But the other side of the value proposition is the fact that we're working towards obtaining our own energy distribution license so that we can become the energy provider for energy intense companies in Germany for the next few years at least. So the value proposition is you are a company, you are spending quite significant amounts of money on electricity that you procure via traditional energy providers, and you've done so probably for many years. And now, ever since last year in 2022, with the beginning of the Ukraine conflict, energy prices have really skyrocketed. They have come down a little bit ever since, but there is a very increased awareness about the lack of professional electricity procurement and the risks that can have. And Trava tries to do two things. We try to analyze and optimize the energy procurement that our customers have, while at the same time connecting them to renewable assets to improve their carbon emissions and essentially their entire sustainability strategy by helping them cut emissions, but also by being able to really prove that what they're doing is actually sustainable, as opposed to a lot of other things that are going on with certificate schemes.
So that's quite cool. And maybe one question to what you just said. You are talking about companies that have a high demand for or high demand for electricity. What type of companies are you referring then? Is it just industrial companies or is it like an office building enough?
So we don't yet categorize by strict verticals. It's both commercial and industrial companies. It kind of depends on the consumption. So the way that we usually classify it is if you spend at least several hundreds of thousands of euros every year on electricity, then you're relevant for us. It's too hard to categorize otherwise because there could be a 50 employee company that manufactures glass, for example, which is very energy intensive, and they could be highly relevant for us, while at the same time a 2000 FTE or employee company that is a tax advisory company sitting in a commercial building might not be relevant. So neither financial KPIs such as revenue or profit are really indicative, nor is the number of employees. It's really about the energy spend. And so I would argue that it's easiest to say if you spend a few hundred thousand of euros on electricity every year, then you're definitely relevant for us.
Editing Juan here. So now I'm editing the video and I noticed that when I was going to ask one question to David, the whole recording went busted and the audio didn't work. What I was going to ask here is about the values of the company. So in the values of the company, they are talking about their values being climate first, innovation, and transparency. And I wanted to get his feedback and opinion of why he chose those ones and why he finds those values important for his startup.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the first one is kind of obvious, but I'd like to explain what it specifically means for us, the climate value. So for us, over the course of the last few years, we've all been active in a lot of different industries. So I was a management consultant with Bain. I worked a lot in telecommunications and technology companies, but my coworkers, they worked also in a bunch of different sectors. And before that, obviously, we've been involved in many different startups. There has always been this part, and I think that's something that a lot of employees and people in the workforce of my age also are experiencing. There's always been this little component that was missing, and it's this added component of knowing that you're doing something that contributes something meaningful to society and for the climate. And I know it sounds like a phrase, but it really does make a difference. And I spoke a lot to, as I mentioned, Anna Alex, who was also the founder of the climate tech company, and she really helped me understand how much of a difference that can make. Not in the beginning, not when you're super excited and motivated about everything that you're doing, but then later on, especially when you're going through the lows and when you're going potentially through crises. She said that it really makes a difference regarding your motivation going into the office every day, giving it your best, because you know that you're building something great and you know that you're building something that you can be proud of later on. And that's something that we are trying to do here with building a climate tech company. We're trying to contribute something meaningful. So that is the element of climate. Then we have this element of transparency. One thing that we notice in this market, but also in some other industries, is fees are often hidden, and structures are shady. And one thing that we really want to do is we want to be super transparent about the way that we monetize, about the way that our solution works, and about what that means for the environment, our customers, and our partners. So that's one of the core values that we have, and one of the ways that we're actually going to build that into our product is that we're going to have this transparency model within our software solution where customers can see, for example, how much CO2 emissions their electricity consumption had actually cost. And we're going to do that in a much more granular level than current traditional providers are doing. So I think that is the transparency element. And then the innovation part is something that's also very interesting. Obviously, innovation matters in all kinds of industries, but in the energy procurement industry and in the energy distribution industry, not that much innovation has happened. And what we're now seeing in the direct to consumer market with companies like Tibber or Ostrom here in Germany, there's a lot of innovation starting to happen. Companies are looking towards demand flexibilization, which means making more active choices as to when to consume electricity. And we're going to do that in our segment, the industry companies, the industrial companies, which in Germany at least is a really big segment, but a segment that is very much dominated by very traditional players that have not yet seen this level of digitalization, process automation, and innovation really influence their processes. And so a lot of what we're going to be doing with our solution is we're going to try to get them there step by step. And so the idea of innovating core business processes and making those innovative changes to their day-to-day business transactions and processes is also at the heart of our values.
So I really like what you just said about the company values, especially when it comes to the climate, because having a value that people then, or the vision that people can believe and can see that they are making a difference. If, of course, they are the people that believe in the same things that you believe, that's something that is very encouraging and very engaging for them to be part of that journey.
Yeah.
I really like that, and I also love the topic of transparency because last week I was in. I have not published it yet. I was also having another podcast interview with another founder, and he was talking also about pricing and moving, maybe because most of the pricing now is done by seats, and moving more towards actual usage because seats don't reflect really usage, and many companies are overpaying for things that they are really not getting advantage or getting very little value from. So I think that that's a very valuable and something that, from the point of view of customers, such a powerful thing to see that, hey, this company is respecting me. They are not
Yeah.
abusive. They are doing a, I think that that's something that people value a lot, and maybe many times companies tend to overlook because status quo, easy to continue, why change?
Yeah. And the interesting thing about the energy industry in that regard is that, like households, where I feel like you could probably, and everyone who's going to be watching could probably, share the same sentiment, you always feel like you're not getting a good deal, right? That's why there are so many switching services. And that's why so many household customers tend to switch their electricity contract every 12 to 24 months, because we feel like whenever we switch, we get a better deal. And why
Yeah.
is that? That's because we feel like, should the energy prices drop, none of the energy companies are going to hand over those savings to us. They're not going to give us a reduction in cost. At least a lot of times that doesn't happen. Sometimes it does. And so they have to constantly fight and spend money on advertising to regain those customers or to keep those customers. And so at the end of the day, that's just really lost cost, because they then have to include those customer acquisition costs into the cost that they then charge to their customers, and nobody wins. And so our approach is essentially, let's have this partnership attitude that is also reflected into our schemes and into our fee structures, so that the customers don't want to move and switch every 12 to 24 months, so that they stay with us and we can actually charge less for our service, and the customer at the end of the day should be winning. That at least is the idea at the moment.
Yeah, that is very true. And if we go back to the climate, I think that was very interesting what you were talking and how people can believe on that. But it's also true that many companies are not necessarily going to care too much about where the electricity or the energy that they're using is coming from. But I'm guessing that there has to be trends also on the regulations by the different countries. I'm guessing that Germany being quite concern generally about environmental issues or aspects is probably going to be one of the countries that is going to be maybe paying more attention to, hey, we have to move towards this direction. And I guess that, how do you see this? How much there is the demand to move towards using more greener sources of energy instead of fossils, nuclear, whatnot, and where are the trends?
Yeah. So I would argue that all stakeholders that a company typically has are currently pushing that company towards choosing renewable electricity. So one of the main stakeholders, of course, are regulative bodies. So if you look at the European Commission, for example, just back in December, they have introduced even more increases to the acceleration of how much CO2 emission certificates are going to cost. But then also on a country level, the German regulatory bodies are becoming more and more strict on enforcing these rules. But the regulatory bodies and the law is just one part. What we're also seeing, which is very powerful, especially in the B2B and producing industries, is the supply chain forces that are pushing companies there. More and more companies are looking to address scope 1 to scope 3 emissions. And so they're looking really in every part of their supply chain, looking at every single supplier of every product component that they source, including electricity, and are looking for how can we reduce CO2 here? Because if they choose products to manufacture their own products that are CO2 intensive, then their products are going to have a worse footprint, and they don't want that because it creates disadvantages, for example, in selling their products. So we have regulatory bodies, we have suppliers and customers that are in this interesting balance at the moment. But then you also have employees, which is a really interesting thing. A lot of the companies that we're speaking to are telling us our people really want us to move into that direction. And so it doesn't necessarily have to have a very clear and short-term business case, and companies, depending on the price, of course, are still willing to take that extra mile or to spend a cent or two more per kilowatt hour. But of course, you're absolutely right. A lot of companies still value price over everything, but then it becomes an issue of, or a problem of making it work that you value price, but you still value electricity that comes from green power plants. It doesn't necessarily need to be a conflict, and that's something that we're also trying to solve through our algorithms.
Yeah. And most of the cases, I'm guessing that, okay, there are going to be the companies that, of course, care more about this and care more about the environment, care more about having the least impact as possible. But then
Yeah.
in the end, many companies, what they're going to care in the end is the price and how,
Yes.
where is the kind of the optimal solution for them. And now that you talk
Exactly.
about customers, how do you work with customers? So while you are building this product, how are you engaging with them? How you are doing maybe discovery, prototyping, mock-ups, and so on? Maybe
Yeah.
we could talk a little bit about this discovery process.
Yeah. So since we're doing large B sales and we're speaking mostly to, let's say, medium-sized companies that have a few hundred employees upwards, or smaller ones that are very energy intensive, we're approaching it a little bit like we learned back in the day in management consulting, where we build presentations and proposals for our clients, and then we speak through these without trying to get into too much project work. While at the same time, we're only using this as a funnel for learning. Later on, we really want to make sure that the engine that we're building can have these clickable funnels, can take care of a lot of the customer education process that we're now doing manually. But at the end of the day, it's always going to be explanation intensive because it's a very complex product. It's also going to be fine that it's a little bit customer education intensive because it's a very high ticket purchase. So these companies spend a few hundred thousand at least, if not seven figures, on electricity every year. So it's also perfectly fine that our sales process can be a little bit more intensive than if you're just trying to sell two seats for 50 euros a month as a SaaS subscription business, right? Then your sales process needs to be super automated because your CAC needs to be low. But that's not necessarily the case for us. So we can have some degree of human interaction. That's perfectly fine. At the moment, we're using these consulting projects where we provide initial analysis and initial potential estimates for our customers as the entry door, as like a Trojan horse, where we then explain what that would mean for our customers and what kind of an impact it would have, and we're using that as a sort of concierge test. We've actively decided not to build landing pages and to test click funnels yet, because we're just not at that point in time yet where we believe we could build a digital version of what we're currently doing in terms of consultation and customer education now, as of now.
So when you think about a the journey that you have been going on now with your customers, what have been maybe the challenges for you to grow a product from scratch? Okay, you have been in other startups, you have done consulting. Of course, there are going to be very uh, quite many similarities on the process and the problems, and maybe in the startup you have been also from the very inception. But now being one of the co-founders, probably the pressure, the responsibilities are in a completely different level. So what are your experiences? Maybe what have been the challenges that you have been finding?
I think there are so many challenges that we're currently dealing with. It's kind of hard to even, put them in buckets and to categorize them. But of course, there are personal challenges, then there are team challenges, but there's also product challenges, right? I think let's start with the product one. So product is interesting because there are a lot of hypotheses that we don't need to validate. So just as an example, we don't need to validate that companies need electricity, right? That's a given. We also don't need to validate that companies value price over most other arguments. And we also don't need to validate that should the price be the same, they would prefer green electricity as opposed to non-green electricity. So there are a lot of hypotheses that we don't need to validate and that are obvious. But then at the end of the day, it's still a very large market, and you have probably hundreds of different purchasing personas, and we need to now figure out what exactly are we going to tailor the product to, and who exactly are we going to tailor the product to. And it's not an easy task because this is electricity procurement that we're talking about. This is not building some direct to consumer app, launching it, iterating on it, doing A/B testing. We have to establish an understanding of what our customers specifically are looking for before we decide to go down a specific route and invest hundreds of thousands of euros into product development and licenses that potentially later on we won't really need. So that is one of the key problems that we're struggling with. How can we really test our hypotheses further without yet being able to completely sell what we're trying to sell? Because to a certain degree, having conversations doesn't get you far enough. We can't risk the process of building everything and then having our customers say, you know what, it sounded cool, but I'm not that interested anymore. And so we're trying to, make our way there. And I would argue that's probably the biggest challenge that we're facing at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, and I can imagine that because my background also has been with B2B companies, especially when you are talking about such big purchasing tickets. The companies don't make a switch like right away,
Exactly.
and they are not willing to go necessarily with prototyping and all this. They might be willing to go to a certain degree, but they're not going to buy a product that doesn't serve their needs. They're not going to buy a product just because it's still on development.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so you only get one shot, and it needs to be professional, and it needs to be trusted, and it needs to be regulated, and all of that. So it's not like with direct to consumer apps where you could, simply spend a few €1,000s on, I don't know, some kind of search engine optimization or social media ads, see if you can get a few hundred users to onboard, watch their usage, iterate quickly on the app. You need to approach the whole product validation and product development process in a lot more sophisticated way, I would argue.
Yeah, I agree, especially when you're thinking about, I think that B2B, there is a little bit that room when you're talking about smaller companies and maybe smaller pricing. But when you're talking about how such a big pricing tickets, then completely different story, and it starts to change quite much the cycles and the way of developing. So we talked earlier in the beginning, you talk about the companies that have been funding your startup. Could you tell us a little bit maybe on those challenges, on how have you been doing the fundraising? How have you been doing your pitch for those VCs? What has been the feedback? Maybe the challenges that you have found there.
Yeah, I think the first thing that we need to explain is the fact that we raised money very early. So we raised money when it was mostly still idea and validation phase. So we didn't yet have a functioning product. We had an MVP, we had the team, we had a very clear vision and roadmap of where we wanted to go and how we wanted to get there. And we had spoken to a lot of potential customers and to a lot of players and suppliers in the value chain. But we were also earlier than most ventures usually are when they start raising capital from professional investors. And so, especially in Germany, where it's not yet normal to raise pre-product and pre-traction, that was obviously a challenge. It was a challenge to explain why we needed to have that money at this early stage. It was also a challenge to explain the complex underlying market and the complex dynamics within the energy market and the electricity markets, because not only are they complex and something that not many investors even understand, while at the same time they changed so much now in recent years, with renewable electricity becoming more and more important, and then ever since the Ukraine conflict started, the electricity market volatility increasing so much that we were constantly struggling to, explain what we're doing and to make our VCs understand and to develop conviction with them together. So I think this early raising was probably the most challenging part. While at the same time, we really wanted to make that happen, because the product that we're building is so complex and the vision is so big that if we would have said, you know what, let's try to raise a few €100,000 in angel money and then let's see how far we can get. Let's be very, very capital constrained. Let's bootstrap our way forward. That's just not something that would have worked with the business model that we're trying to develop.
Sorry, I'll start again because something was
Mm-hmm.
kind of blinking there. So if you think about the experiences that you have had, what you have been learning over this time, and maybe not necessarily just in Trawa, but maybe in other companies during your consulting or other startups, if you think about like one or two recommendations that you could give to another startup founder or people that are working with launching or building new products, what would those be?
So I think taking the time, taking that leap of faith, and then taking the time is probably the most important one that would just jump in my mind right away. I think a lot of the people that never get around to actually trying to build something but wanted to are because they didn't take that leap of faith. And I think one thing that we need to point out is obviously you need to be in somewhat of a privileged position where you have at least the money to go for, let's say, 2 to 3 months without salary, and you feel, brave enough to take that leap of faith, especially, depending on the market economy and the situation. But if you're in a solid, position career wise, right? Let's say you've been working for a company and you feel at least relatively confident that you would be able to get back in to the same company or potentially a different company that's going to pay the same amount. I would urge people to just try to take the time, potentially like an extended leave, because at least with working as a management consultant, there was never enough headspace and never enough time to actually commit to anything. And if you can't commit to anything, and if you're so restrained time-wise and energy-wise, then it's always so easy to find reasons not to do anything. And I really think that you need to be in that headspace to actually give things a chance and to, take a week to work on something and to dive really deep into a market and to talk to potential customers. And so I really feel it's tough to do that just between midnight and 3 a.m.
Yeah, that is so true, and it's true that when you are working with a like 9 to 5 job, it's difficult to find that time and family. So there's very little time that you can be scratching to do and to try and test potentially new ideas. So yeah, definitely it's something that it requires time, and it requires that headspace to be able to grow. Otherwise, it's going to be quite slow. Of course, you can do it in the evening, but not the same thing.
Exactly.
But hey, David, I don't want to take more of your time. You're a pretty busy man, and you are building an awesome company, and definitely really hope to hear more of it about it in the future. How you're growing, maybe how you're expanding to other areas. Thank you very much for being here with us and sharing your experiences.
Awesome. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
David, maybe before we close down, you could just tell us quickly where people can find you and where they can find Trawa. I will make sure to include those links in the description.
Yeah, the best place would probably be LinkedIn. So I pretty much check my LinkedIn every day, and I actually respond, not always on the same day, but usually in the short term. So I would guess that's the best approach.
Hey, if you reach to the end of the video, I want to say thank you very much for coming here. If you enjoy the content, please give it a like and subscribe. I promise they are much better technically in the other videos. I'm really sorry for the problems that I had in this one. And I'm going to put all the links to find Trawa and David in the description and the pinned comment down below. So please go check them out if you are interested in the solutions that Trawa is building. As for David, I want to thank you very much for taking part in the episode and sharing your thoughts and experiences with us. So remember to hit the subscribe and notification bell if you want to be reminded when I upload in the next video. Take care, and I will see you in the next one.